5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live, sleeping live. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, we really appreciate you. Thanks for tuning in. You know, we've been on now for what? We're getting close to 2 years, Sam?
It depends how you count it, because we did 3 episodes and then we stopped for a long time and then we came back. So
right.
It depends how you count it exactly.
But it's a long time.
It's been a while. Yeah, we're on episode 137.
And we're trying to keep it new and fresh and as topical as we possibly can, right?
Absolutely. And today's topicalness derives from the Supreme Court. Am I right?
What could be more topical and what could be more significant?
Right.
Let me take you back a little ways.
Oh,
you know,
thanks.
It seems like decades ago, but it's not that long ago. Remember Jack Smith, Sam?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the special prosecutor. And he had these very serious indictments against Donald Trump. And Donald Trump claimed immunity, right? Said, you can't get me because I'm the president. And the lower court, the appeals court, all ruled against him. So Jack Smith, I think even before we got the appeals court, said, look, to the Supreme Court, you are obviously going to decide this. It's very important the American people get to know whether he's guilty or not. You've expedited things before. Can you expedite this? Did they?
No.
No, they dragged on forever. In the Nixon case, actually, a very serious constitutional issue about executive privilege, they acted within just a very few weeks to actually reach a decision, much less. But this time the Supreme Court delays, deflects, delays, and then issues this broad immunity decision, punts it back to the lower courts, and, of course, runs out the clock. So the American people, because of the Supreme Court's delay and ultimate decision. But if they hadn't delayed, they may have been able to deal with that decision and have the American people know before the election. So now Trump brings a case. And does the Supreme Court delay for months upon months?
Hasn't seemed to.
They act almost immediately, I think within a month. Here we are at a hearing on so-called birthright citizenship.
Right, because this is not actually ruling on birthright citizenship itself. It's ruling whether or not lower courts can block Trump's executive order, essentially, right? Can you explain that to the people?
Yeah. Now, here's the thing, and I'll explain why it's related to birthright citizenship, even though that's not the issue before the Supreme Court. The formal issue before the Supreme Court has to do with whether lower courts, particularly district courts, can issue nationwide injunctions.
Right.
This actually became a big issue, not now, but much earlier.
When?
During the Biden administration.
Oh.
Do you remember the big decision on mifepristone,
yes,
the anti-abortion pill?
Right. It was by some small judge in some small
in Amarillo, the one judge in Amarillo.
Right.
Maybe the most conservative judge, or certainly one of the most conservative judges in America, issues a nationwide injunction on birth control pills. Did you see Donald Trump and the Republicans screaming about that? You can't do this. You can't issue a nationwide injunction.
Weird. I don't remember that, no.
You don't remember that. It's not because you have a bad memory.
Oh.
It's because none of that ever happened. They were perfectly content with a nationwide decision.
Now, before you get to that, we have to stop for a moment and hear a word from today's sponsor, Dad.
It's great that we have a sponsor that helps keep us on the air.
Absolutely. Here is Aura.
With everything going on right now, we are glad that today's video is sponsored by Aura. We all remember how a group of young Dodge employees, propped up by a billionaire tech mogul, got access to Social Security's private databases. And just recently, the national security breach through a Signal group chat tells us that no one is looking out for your sensitive data except you. Hackers already stole billions of records from a national background check system. Full names, addresses, phone numbers, and even social security numbers dumped online for free. That kind of breach puts every American at risk. That's why I recommend Aura. Aura monitors the dark web, alerts you fast if your information shows up where it shouldn't, and backs it up with $5 million in identity theft insurance. You get real protection all in one app. Go to aura.com/Alan Lichtman to start your free 14-day trial and find out if your data's already been exposed. Again, that's aura.com/Alan Lichtman. In today's world, you can't afford to be passive. Protect yourself and your family.
All right, thank you to Aura. Now, Dad, we were talking about the Missa Prifstone case and how Republicans didn't seem perturbed by that nationwide injunction by that Texas judge.
I would say I'd go a little bit further than that. Not only didn't they seem perturbed, they embraced it.
Right.
They loved it.
Right.
They had no problem with it. So when did all of a sudden Republicans have problems with nationwide injunctions?
When it was going against things that they were trying to enact.
Exactly. And, we heard not just the idea from Trump and his cronies that you can't do this, this is horrible. These decisions should only apply to the limited number of plaintiffs that appear before the district court. But they also went on to say to disparage, to attack these judges, even though quite a few of them who ruled against him on various issues were appointed by Republicans, including some appointed by whom, Sam?
DJT.
Exactly, but these are all lunatics. They should be impeached. You even got a rare rebuke from a solid conservative justice. Who is that, Sam? John Roberts. The Chief Justice said, this is not right. Impeachment is not the way you deal with decisions you don't like. That's why we have appeals. So now we have an appeal. We have an appeal quickly short track to the Supreme Court. And I just want to, for a moment, even though it's not on the table, it is relevant, go over birthright citizenship. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Here's what the 14th Amendment says. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, all persons.
All.
Didn't say black people like Trump claims. Oh, this is just for black babies. No, didn't say that. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Are these so-called illegal immigrants, Sam, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States?
Yes.
Yeah. They get arrested for crimes like anybody else, right? They can't claim diplomatic immunity like a diplomat can. Diplomats or soldiers of a foreign army. That's what they're talking about. In fact, immediately after this amendment was passed, thousands of the children of persons here illegally immediately got citizenship. Did you know that?
No.
Nobody does. Who are these persons here illegally? Well, in 1807, the United States Congress and the President signed a law prohibiting the international slave trade. That is, you could not legally bring in slaves. Did that stop slavers and traders from bringing in slaves, smuggling them in illegally?
No.
No. Many thousands were brought in. So they were all here illegally. And guess what? All of their children got citizenship.
Right.
If they were born in the United States. What more proof positive can you need, aside from the fact that a very conservative Supreme Court granted citizenship to someone from China, not, someone brought here as a slave from Africa. And if you look at the debates, it's clear that they did not mean this to limit it, except those who were not subject to jurisdiction, and all so-called illegal immigrants, as we know, are subject to jurisdiction. I don't think Trump wants to say they're not, because then he can't arrest and deport them.
Right.
Now, moreover, here's what Trump said in his first term. Remember, he was making all these Supreme Court appointments?
Yeah.
He said, quote, I can tip you off. I guess this is Mike Pence now talking what Trump told him. I can tip you off. President Trump's going to keep his promise to the American people, and he's going to nominate a strict constructionist to the Supreme Court. Do you know what a strict constructionist is?
Someone that follows the Constitution to a T.
To a T. Now, himself, Trump said when he was appointing Brett Kavanaugh, in keeping with President Reagan's legacy, I do not ask about a nominee's personal opinions. What matters is not judges' political views, but whether they can set aside those views and do what the law and the Constitution require. So of all people, Donald Trump should be adhering to the strict letter of the Constitution. And, of course, he's not. Now, why does this matter?
I don't know.
In a case which supposedly only dealing with the question of nationwide injunctions from district court judges.
You tell me. You're the smart guy.
I don't know. You're pretty young and sharp. I'm just old and broken down. But at any rate.
You're not supposed to say that.
Yeah, right. Oh, right. Take that back. I'm young and sharp, too. This is the worst case that Trump could have brought on nationwide injunctions. Here's why. Because while things like abortion, they could be established state by state, right? Mm-hmm. You can have some states with strict and some states with loose abortion laws. That is not true of citizenship.
Right.
You cannot have citizenship varying from state to state. That is an impossible situation for the country, particularly since people are constantly moving across state lines.
Total disaster.
A total disaster. A total mess. Plus, this case directly involves an explicit provision of the Constitution. Even, the Dobbs case involving abortion was more of a gray area because was there an explicit right to abortion in the Constitution, Sam?
No.
No, it had to be interpreted. But here, right in black and white, is a very explicit right to birthright citizenship.
I've heard some people describe it as literally written in blood.
It is literally written in the blood of the Civil War and is part of the broadly egalitarian movement that followed the Civil War, that led to the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment not only establishing birthright citizenship, but establishing equal protection under the law and due process of law. By the way, what did Trump say when he was asked about due process?
He had to talk to his lawyers or something.
Yeah, he said, well, maybe it's there, but it's impractical. We'd have too many trials, Forget about these constitutional rights, They really don't matter that. But it's right there in black and white, birthright citizenship, due process, equal protection under the law. This is not a gray area.
Right.
This is not the so-called penumbra of the Constitution.
You're just making up words. Penumbra? That's not a real word.
Penumbra is a real word. Look it up.
No, it's not.
Yes, and it was used by the court to talk about abortion rights coming from the penumbra, kind of the outer stretch of the Constitution.
See, I told you you're a smart guy. You know big words.
Yeah, and I'm glad you ask about them, but I'm sure our audience is as smart as I am.
Oh, you're saying I'm the only idiot here.
That's possible.
That's possible.
Who knows?
But this is an interesting discussion because national injunctions aren't by nature good or by nature bad, right?
Depends who issues them and what your values are.
Well, I would say more like this case seems pretty clear that a national injunction makes sense because, like you said, if it was a state-by-state issue, you would have complete chaos. You could be a citizen when you're in California, but not when you're in Utah.
And what happens when you cross the border?
Right, exactly. That's what I'm saying. So it seems to me like national injunctions are more on a case-by-case basis, whether they're good or bad. Am I interpreting that correctly?
I think you proved, in fact, how smart you are.
Oh.
I think you put your finger on it, why this is such a terrible case for the Trump administration to be bringing before the court. Because if there was ever an instance in which a national injunction was justified, appropriate, and proper, it's in the case of birthright citizenship. Very different than the case of abortion.
Right.
Where, in fact, you could, and you do, today have a whole patchwork of different state abortion laws. You can't have that when it comes to citizenship of persons. And here's another thing.
Say it, Dad.
Another thing that makes a nationwide injunction so appropriate. And this was, I think, came up in the oral argument, although it wasn't supposed to be focused on the substance of the order. It got into it a little bit. I think the lawyer for the Trump administration was asked, how do you administer this? How do you enforce this? How do you know whether someone born in Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, is born of undocumented immigrants or legal immigrants or U.S. citizens? How do you know that, Sam?
I don't know.
You have to do what the Nazis did, establish a biological police.
Yikes.
You'd have to look into the citizenship or immigration status of every set of parents, or where it's, a mother who doesn't have a partner, the mother. In other words, you have to look into, give me your papers, the citizenship.
Right.
And lots of people can't prove their citizenship. Is that what you're going to be thinking about when you're in labor? Oh, I got to get my papers to prove I'm a citizen?
And, obviously you can prove in the delivery room who the mom is, but you can't necessarily prove who the dad is in the delivery room without, a DNA test, right?
Exactly. And, often the dad isn't there.
Right. So what if the mom's illegal, right, but the dad is legal, but the dad's not there, and how do you prove that could get messy.
Exactly.
John Rogers just gifted 5 memberships. Thank you, John.
Oh, thank you. That's another reason why this is such an awful case for the Trump administration to bring. If ever, whatever you may think generically, right, about nationwide injunctions, if ever there was a case for a nationwide injunction, it's this one. Right. That's why it was a huge mistake to bring it. Now, I do think if it was a straightforward matter of nationwide injunctions and didn't involve all the complications of an explicit constitutional provision and all the complications of multiple citizenships, determining citizenship, I think there would be a conservative majority on this court to say district courts cannot issue nationwide injunctions. But given the complexities of this particular case, I'm not certain that's going to happen.
So you're the prediction professor. Give us what you think. How do you think?
I think they're going to thread the needle somehow.
Right.
They're going to find some narrow ground to move on this. They'll delay it. Probably won't give a decision till late June or the beginning of July. And then, Roberts is pretty good at finding, these kind of middle ground solutions. I don't think they're going to absolutely bar injunctions from district courts. I don't think they'll absolutely sanction it. I think they'll find some way of distinguishing this particular case and make a narrow ruling based on this case. But it's not like I have a system for predicting Supreme Court decisions. I'm pretty good at predicting generally, as you know, but this is not, Lichtman's keys to the Supreme Court. This is just my having studied American politics for, God, I hate to say it, a long time.
Kathy Nelson gifted 5 memberships. Thank you so much,
nice.
Kathy. And Bob sent a $20 donation. Thank you, Bob.
We really appreciate it. We really need these memberships.
I also heard somebody talking about this earlier, that in the Mr. Pristone case, a that what county was it in Texas?
Amarillo
County, Texas.
City of Amarillo.
City of Amarillo judge ruled a nationwide injunction, but then as appeals came, higher courts removed that injunction. So isn't that the exact remedy to this, and not just saying, oh, judges can't make nationwide injunctions?
That's what I was saying, exactly.
Oh, that's what you were saying. Okay.
You know, limited to this case. And one of the things that they did in the, and it's kind of turned around this time, in reversing Judge Kaczmarek, was to say the plaintiffs didn't have standing. You know, they weren't performing abortions. You know, they really did not have a direct stake in the case. That's not the issue here. I don't think standing is a way that they're going to resolve this.
Right.
Standing is always a good out for the court, right? Because that gives them a way of getting out of the controversy without taking a position.
From what I've heard on reporting on the case, it seems like Amy Coney Barrett seems to be leaning against the Trump administration. But even if she breaks off from the rest of the conservatives, the Trump administration could still win this case, right?
There are 6 conservatives. If only one breaks and the other go with the Trump administration, Trump wins.
But you don't think that's going to happen?
I don't think it's going to happen, but I have to say I was surprised by the scope and breadth of the immunity decision. Right, I thought they'd give him some limited immunity. I didn't think they'd make it that absolute. So yeah, I could be surprised. But as I said, my prediction is it's not going to be that clean one way or another, that they'll somehow find a way to thread the needle on this without ultimately deciding about nationwide injunctions as a generic as opposed to a specific matter in this case. I also think they may well fast track the substance. And, you know, one way to get out of this is to deal with the substance before they make a decision on the procedure. In other words, decide one way or another whether the substance of the injunction is valid. And if they rule that it's not, then it doesn't matter. If they rule that it is, it doesn't matter. In other words, they could supersede the procedural issues if before they issue their ruling, they fast-track an analysis of the substance.
Yeah, but you think they're going to do that? I mean,
I'd be surprised.
That seems, like...
That would be somewhat extreme, but that's another thing they can do. My prediction is they'll find some narrow way around making a final decision on this. But I do think while they may not fast track it, they probably won't either slow walk a decision on the merits. I think that'll come to the court this year, not next year.
Right. I mean, I think they should make a decision on the merits. I think they should grow a spine and rule on this idea of birthright citizenship and say, it's in the Constitution, bro. What are you even doing?
Yeah, why mess around with procedural issues, which are really not central? What is central to this? This is in the Constitution. They have an exception, but clearly the people you're targeting do not fall within that exception because they are clearly under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Otherwise, you wouldn't be arresting them all.
Right.
You don't arrest diplomats.
Right.
And it's not just for black people. The Supreme Court decision had to do with an Asian. And lots of people here illegally, thousands, without anyone questioning it at the time. And remember, conservatives are supposed to be concerned with the plain meaning of the Constitution as understood at the time. And at the time, nobody questioned that the children of slaves brought here illegally, who were in the U.S. illegally, were citizens.
Right. All right, you want to move on to our next topic, which is the GOP spending bill.
Yeah, or, more of a tax bill.
Tax bills, but
than spending bill.
Frame it.
It's a pretty simple bottom line.
Okay, tell it to me then, man.
Yeah. It contains enormous tax breaks.
For who?
Overwhelmingly to the wealthy. That's inevitable when you cut back on income taxes, because poor people don't pay income taxes, right?
Well, not to the same degree.
Poor people don't pay at all. Poor people.
Oh, poor people.
And middle-class people pay to some degree.
Yeah.
But what do poor people and middle-class people mostly pay to the federal government? Not personal income tax.
Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
Payroll taxes.
Payroll taxes, right.
Which get deducted from their paycheck and you can't get back.
Janine Graham just donated $50. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's what most people pay.
Right.
Not the rich. It's a tiny fraction of what the rich pay, particularly since these payroll taxes are capped. So the very rich, are paying a minuscule fraction of their income. I read an independent analysis which said 30%, a third, of the tax cuts are going to the top 1%, not the top 10 or 5, and the big corporations. Top 1% and the big corporations.
Right.
And the majority of it is going to the wealthier Americans with minimal amounts for the middle class and nothing, essentially, for poor Americans. Not only that, independent analyses have said this is going to drill a huge hole in the deficit.
No, Republicans are the ones that are supposed to save us from the deficit.
Yeah, I remember Trump saying, I'm going to bring down the deficit. Yeah. I'm going to bring down it fast. Maybe as fast as I'm going to end the Ukraine-Russian war.
I've been hearing Republicans saying my whole life they're going to end the deficit.
They've been saying this since the days of Calvin Coolidge, who you probably don't remember.
I don't remember.
But was president in the 1920s.
A good thing I don't remember.
Yeah, they've been saying this for 100 years, at least 100 years in modern American history. They've even proposed balanced budget amendments, even though they knew they had zero chance of passing.
I have a Washington Post article that says the GOP tax bill is on track to add more than $2.5 trillion to the U.S. deficit.
And that assumes they'll make all the spending cuts.
Right.
And that's the low end of the estimate. It's anywhere from 2.5 to 4, not billion, trillion dollars added to the deficit to benefit those who don't need it. And while they're benefiting those who don't need it, who are they hurting?
Your average American.
Or poor and vulnerable Americans. What are they cutting? Medicaid
right.
and food stamps. The Independent Budget Office has estimated that if these cuts go into effect, 8.6 million Americans will lose their health care. Think about that.
But I thought and
that doesn't even count the health problems of losing your food stamps.
But I thought all they're doing is rooting out all the fraud and waste within these programs. Is that true?
Fraud and waste is like election fraud or DEI.
Right.
It's a buzzword.
Right.
It's meaningless. There's almost no fraud and waste in these programs. It's a minuscule percent. Have they identified any in this bill?
I know, you tell me.
I haven't seen it.
Why aren't they ever concerned about the fraud and waste that is done by rich people or corporations? Why don't they investigate that?
That's the biggest fraud and waste.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Remember, and I know I'm repeating this, but it's such an astounding figure. Since 1989, so about 35 years, over $13 trillion in wealth has been transferred from 99% of us, not 50% of us, 99% of us to the top 1%.
I feel like I'm living in Groundhog's Day. It's like, why are these rural Americans, middle Americans, why do they keep getting up every election and voting for these Republicans who show time and time again they are not acting in their interest? I don't like, how many times do they have to give tax cuts to the rich? How many times do they have to threaten or actually cut Medicare? Like, how many times do they have to do this before rural America goes, wait a second?
Oh, come on. That is of no consequence when compared with banning gay pride parades. Come on, what's more important?
I just can't wrap my mind.
They agitate on these social and cultural issues, which resonate with people.
But that seems ridiculous. Like, so you're from, a rural county in Wisconsin, and you're getting up and you're voting based off of gay pride parades? I mean, come on.
I'm using that as an illustration.
I know, but my point is...
you're voting on these social issues, the gays and the lesbians and the transgenders, the deranged liberals are destroying the fiber of our country.
I know,
what could be more important?
What are they going to just look at what's happening and say, wait a second, these Republicans are not fiscally conservative. They're raising our deficit. They're not benefiting anybody except for the rich and the corporations. They are not out to support me, so I need to stop voting for them. When is that going to happen?
Grab my book. It's right behind you. It's all in my book. I go through this entire analysis. Conservative at the core, a new history of American conservatism. I examine all of these issues, Sam, that you raised and explain how they've evolved and developed over the last 100 years.
So you're saying this isn't new?
This is nothing new.
So it's even crazier than I'm saying. I'm just thinking about the last 15
no, it's
years.
Nothing new. And I explain how Trump, contrary to what some old conservatives like Bill Kristol and George Will have said, did not hijack or betray conservatism. He is the logical culmination of 100 years of conservative history, going all the way back to the abortion issue of 1919, 1920, prohibition. Now we have prohibition on abortion. Then they had prohibition on the sale and manufacture of alcohol. And then they also had big tax cuts for the rich, big deregulation, criminalization of so-called deviant sexual behavior. Virtually any issue that's agitated today, except for some foreign policy issues, which are more nuanced, has its origin in the years immediately following World War I. This also shows that American conservatism was not a reaction to the growth of the liberal state, which is mainly due to Franklin Roosevelt. The American conservative movement, the modern one, developed right after World War I in all those ways I've described a decade before or more the administration of FDR.
I have a theory, and let me know what you think about it. It's more of a psychological theory than it is a political theory. So I heard this stat the other day that 44% of Americans think they can achieve billionaire status, and 6 in 10 strive to be, quote, mega wealthy. Do you think it's this weird psychological thing with Americans where we're told we can become as rich as humanly possible. We're told we can become billionaires. So these voters are getting up, voting explicitly against their interests in this weird psychological game where they think eventually they'll be a billionaire and it'll help them.
There's a lot of evidence to say you're exactly right, Sam. This famous quote, I think it's from Will Rogers, back in the 1920s, when he says, poor Americans never got anywhere under Calvin Coolidge, never got anywhere under his successor, Warren Harding. Now we're electing Herbert Hoover, and they all expect to be millionaires under Hoover. This is, again, nothing new. This idea that, if we keep everything open, you too can be a Donald Trump. Jeff Bezos, right?
Bezos.
You get that right. Absolutely, that is a big part of it. Another element is something I talk about extensively in my book, and that is the great paradox of American politics. On the one hand, really beginning with FDR to the present, people expect their benefits from government, right? If you're an old Republican, are you going to give up your Social Security?
No,
of course not. If you're hit by a hurricane, are you going to say, we don't want FEMA to come in here and give us money?
No,
of course not. Everybody wants, regardless of your politics or ideology, you all want the benefits of government. But on the other hand, you hate your government.
Right.
You think it's a swamp, it's inefficient, it's corrupt, it's elite. You think it destroys rugged individualism. And so this is kind of the paradox around which American politics has really centered for nearly 100 years.
I've been watching Seinfeld recently, and in one of his opening monologues, I forgot which episode it is, but he talks about how government are parents for adults. And that's how most adults, it's kind of a necessary, you need parents, but also they're a pain in the ass.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Before we get to questions, there are a couple of other things I want to talk about.
Yes.
Do you know what they snuck in to this bill?
Yes.
That had to do with guns?
Yes, because you already told me. But
they snuck in, and this is huge, hundreds of page bill. They snuck in a special break for, get this, not just the manufacturers of guns, but the manufacturers of silencers get a special tax break in this bill that will cost us $1.5 billion. We can't help people who need medical care or kids, but we can certainly help assassins and gang members and criminals who use silencers.
Yeah, even for simple self-defense, why would you need a silencer?
Nobody uses a silencer for self-defense because it makes the guns less accurate.
Right.
It's obviously not used for target practice or hunting or collecting. It's only used for kind of concealed murders.
Why is it
or assaults.
In there? Why is it in there? It's just some big gun lobby.
Yeah, the gun lobby. They're enthralled to the gun. But this, it's a small thing. But it should outrage every American. And it gives you just an inkling of just how corrupt what is going on with this bill really is. How can you even, in any universe, think about aiding the manufacturers of silencers while you're taking health care away from our kids?
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's absolutely crazy. Final thing that's on my mind is a lot, but I would eventually like to get to questions, and that is what's happening to the Voting Rights Act.
Oh, right.
Voting Rights Act. Ronald Reagan, none other than Ronald Reagan, in signing an extended extension of the Voting Rights Act, called it the crown jewel of our rights. Nothing is more fundamental than voting. Hundreds upon hundreds of lawsuits have been filed that have greatly advanced our right to vote, which unfortunately is not enshrined in the Constitution, which makes, unfortunately, the Voting Rights Act more vulnerable. Well, the first major blow was dealt in 2013 when the Supreme Court, in an opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts, struck down the preclearance provision, saying jurisdictions with a history of voting discrimination have to pre-clear laws and regulations with the Justice Department. Many hundreds upon hundreds of discriminatory measures were struck down through that. And it's very efficient because you don't have to go through years of uncertain litigation. That's gone. There are a number of other decisions, such as Brojnovich in the Arizona case, weakening the interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. But an even bigger blow was just dealt by a 3-judge panel in a 2-1 decision of the Eighth Circuit, which is almost 100% appointed by Republicans. These were 3 Republican-appointed judges, including one by Trump, and there was still a dissent. And you know what they said, Sam?
Tell me.
Private citizens cannot bring litigation under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That's the broad anti-discrimination section.
What?
Only the federal government can bring them. There have been at least since the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, 400 cases.
That's a lot.
Brought by private litigants, a number of which went to the Supreme Court without any controversy. I was involved in one of them, many of them, but I was involved in a very famous one.
Which one?
Case back in the early 2000s, 2006, involving the congressional redistricting plan in the state of Texas. And the Supreme Court cited my work and I wasn't working for the Department of Justice. I was working for private litigants. Supreme Court cited my work in striking down a district because it discriminated against Hispanic voters. There was no issue about my work not being under the aegis of the Justice Department. And how likely is the Trump Justice Department to bring voting rights suits? Zip. Unless maybe it involves white Afrikaners, right. Which, is another astonishing thing they've done. People in places like Sudan, where millions of people have been displaced from their homes. People are constant danger of death, assault, rape. They're not worthy of refugee status. But somehow white South Afrikaners whose ancestors were involved in one of the greatest horrors of our modern time, apartheid, which didn't end until the 1990s. Maybe even some of these people, if they're old enough, were involved themselves. They're the richest part of the country. They're not under assault or being killed. And yet they, of all people, are privileged for refugee status. And moreover, Trump said he's going to speed them along to citizenship.
Crazy.
Well,
that's pretty concerning that only the federal government can bring...
That's what the Eighth Circuit panel has said. Now, I presume this issue will eventually get to the Supreme Court. I am not at all optimistic about what they're going to do. This would, in effect, for any conservative administration, completely shut down the Voting Rights Act. Right. And even in a liberal Democratic administration, make it way more difficult because Justice Department can't bring every case. They don't have unlimited resources.
Right. All right, with that, we will move on to questions. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. We've got 1,000 people watching, only 400 likes. Make sure you like the stream. You can follow us on our handles below. Remember, members and donations get priority in questions.
And help us.
Help us what? What do you
Stay
mean?
on the air. Donations and memberships.
I just said that.
Oh, because you're a smart kid. My hearing is
Philip H., our good friend, says... So if they rule in Trump's favor, does this mean we can ignore past injunctions, for example, abortion or prior injunction?
That's a really good question, and I think that'll come back before the Supreme Court since it's an unsettled question. The problem is, though, the abortion question is probably ultimately going to be decided by the Supreme Court anyway. It's the lower court injunction is on hold for the moment. The mifepristone is still available, so it's not an immediate live issue. But that's a great question that the court may have to address in the future.
But that's probably one of the can of worms they don't want to open. And that's probably why, like you said, they'll skirt around this issue so they don't have to open some crazy sort of...
It would open so many thorny issues and problems to just say nationwide injunctions don't apply. Right. Trump's executive order is in force.
Now, could they say maybe that, could they be super diabolical and say that, well, injunctions still are okay, but in this case, we're actually going to say that they're not okay?
I'd be really surprised, because if there's any case in which they wouldn't be okay, it would be this one.
I know, but I'm just saying.
Look, anything is possible.
Yeah.
But I'd be surprised. That's all I can say.
Limited Light says, why does a district judge issuing a national injunction matter when the executive order is unconstitutional?
Because only the district court would have decided that it is unconstitutional, and the argument is it's not a matter of the substance of the ruling, it's a matter of the jurisdiction of the district court, regardless of the substance of the issue on which they rule. That's the argument. I don't think that's a legitimate argument, but that's the point as to why the constitutionality of the executive order is not directly at play in this particular litigation before the Supreme Court.
What if Donald Trump made an executive order and says, I now can revoke whoever's citizenship I want, I can go around murdering people, would the court be like, yeah, but a lower court can't rule if that's illegal or not? I mean, in that context, it sounds ridiculous. Right?
Well, I think they would say, we'll immediately take it, and, we don't have to worry about the lower courts.
I guess, but isn't that the whole point of having lower courts, is that everything doesn't have to raise immediately to the Supreme Court?
That's correct.
Okay. Professor, now that some Republican lawmakers are speaking out about the Qatar jet gift, do you think it will not happen?
I have very little faith in Republicans speaking out. They spoke out about a lot of the utterly unqualified Trump appointees, including RFK Jr., who just utterly embarrassed himself before the United States Congress, leaving aside his quack medical views. He had no idea what was going on in his own department. Didn't know what the cuts were or who was affected or what parts of his organization were cut and what parts weren't. Then he said, don't take any medical advice from me. You're the chief medical officer of the United States. You're the head of the CDC, which issues medical advice all the time. So, we heard a lot of hot air and a lot of bluster about from these appointees. And of all Trump's appointees, how many got voted down by the Senate?
I don't think a single one.
Zero. Yeah. I mean, this Ed Martin guy withdrew before he got a vote.
Matt Gaetz withdrew. But no one, almost all of them came up for votes. And not a single one of them, including RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth, utterly unqualified people, were turned down. So I have very little faith in the bluster of these Republicans as to what they will do when push comes to shove. Same thing with this big House spending and tax cut bill. A lot of Republicans are speaking out against it. I have little faith that when push comes to shove, they'll do the right thing. Our good friend Krasimir Boyanov says, Sam is trying to figure out why the people from rural areas voted for Trump. Professor, aside from financial reasons, do you believe it is related to their level and type of education and religious beliefs?
Well, I already talked at some length about, have I not, Sam, about how it related to their religious beliefs. And Casimir is absolutely right. There is a huge education divide today, with college-educated persons much more likely to vote Democratic, and those without a college education much more likely to vote Republican. I also think, at least in recent years, in the last few decades, it has to do with the sources of information that people get. You're kind of assuming that people get information and analyze it to properly understand their financial interests with respect to government policy. And that certainly is not necessarily true anymore. But by the way, what's really interesting is, back in the days of FDR, it was the less educated, less wealthy people who voted Democratic, and the more heavily educated, more wealthy people who voted Republican.
That sort of makes more sense logically in my
Absolutely.
mind than what we're living today.
Yeah, it's very strange.
TR Khan says, would you support an amendment allowing deportation of U.S.-born children of undocumented parents if the statute of limitation was, say, 3 years?
Under no circumstances. According to the Constitution, they're U.S. citizens. Plain as day. This is not a penumbra. It's not a gray area. And they should not be deported under any circumstances.
Why would that change anything? I don't even understand this question.
I guess it puts a moratorium of 3 years, but it should be a moratorium of forever because they're U.S. citizens.
Right, 3 years, and then what?
Yeah. Then you ship U.S. citizens out of the country. I don't get it. But I like our members still.
I never said I didn't. When did I say I didn't?
You didn't?
I didn't understand the question. I just don't understand what they're trying to get at.
Yeah. But I think our answer was the right one.
James Lagruta says, there have been calls for Trump to pardon Derek Chauvin. Even if Trump were to issue such a pardon, for state charges, and Derek Chauvin was the guy in the police officer in the George Floyd case, in case you didn't know. Even if there was such a pardon for state charges, wouldn't he already have pardoned his 36 felony counts?
34, but...
That's what I meant to say.
No, you cannot pardon for state charges. The constitutional pardon power, and Trump certainly wants to interpret that power as literally as possible, as close to the plain meaning of the Constitution as possible, even though he wants to totally mangle and reinterpret the Birthright Citizenship clause. But the pardon power only applies to federal charges. He can't pardon Chauvin for state charges, and he can't pardon himself for his 34 felony counts because they occurred in New York State Court.
Our good friend Patrick Murray says...
Oh, he's been forever.
He's been around for a while. Adam Schiff recently revealed he did not approve of Biden's preemptive pardon for him because it's unprecedented and taints the January 6th committee. I know you're not a lawyer, but can Trump use this in court to overturn Biden's pardons?
Simple answer is no. There is no judicial... Keep that up, please. There's no judicial review of presidential pardons. It's one of the very few presidential powers that's absolute. Compare that to the veto power. Yes, a president can veto legislation, but Congress can overturn the veto by a 2/3 vote. Nor is a preemptive pardon unprecedented. What is the most famous pardon in U.S. history? By far. It's not even close.
Tricky Dick Nixon.
Yes. And was that a preemptive pardon?
Yeah, he wasn't charged.
Absolutely. It was completely... Nixon hadn't been charged or convicted of any federal crimes. It was preemptive with respect to any future charges, just like this one.
This is from Noah. Hi, Professor. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether we're currently witnessing the decline of the American empire. Are we in the stage of imperial decline? And if so, what historical parallels do you see between the United States today and past empires in their waning period?
You know, as you know, I'm not very keen on making snap historical judgments. It really takes some time before we could fully understand the full thrust of the change of the trends of history. But I do think it's a very smart question. I do think it's something to monitor and to consider. And I do think there is some chance, that we could be in the stage. I'm not going to go all the way back to Rome, but there are a lot of possibilities, certainly. If you look at Britain and the Soviet Union, they were overextended, and they had internal contradictions. One of the reasons the Soviet Union fell was its internal contradictions. That is, it could not maintain its control over the people without causing massive popular discontent because of the way it was repressing everyone, and it could not sustain broad prosperity for the people overall, even though the oligarchs at the top of the pyramid were enriching themselves.
This is from John Rogers. I'm going to try to do it in a dramatic monologue. You ready?
I'm ready. I like drama.
Where the hell is Congress anyway? They seem to be doing nothing as usual. Even if these ridiculous MAGAs won't allow anything remotely constitutional go through, shouldn't we try? At least let them know we're here and we're going to fight like hell. I know that Republicans have no principles and Democrats have no spine, but at some point, let's make some noise.
Sam, you made a lot of good noise there. And I couldn't agree more with John Rogers. How many times have you heard me pound on this issue, Sam?
A lot.
A lot. I have constantly talked about the Democrats' need to grow a spine. They need to be like Cory Booker, right? Or AOC. Those are very good models. They need to greatly spruce up and improve their messaging. One of the reasons why people are perplexed why ordinary Americans are voting Republican is that their messaging is vastly, vastly better than the messaging of the Democrats. How much time do we have?
7 minutes.
Oh, plenty of time.
Although, I don't know. I think this whole Medicare cut thing and them trying to hide behind all these
You mean
fraud.
Medicaid?
What did I say? Medicaid, and them trying to hide behind all this fraud and abuse. I think that messaging is going to come back to bite them.
I agree. It's not working.
Right.
If you look at the polling data, Americans are not buying what the Republicans are selling in this. The problem is they're not buying what the Democrats are selling either.
True.
Maybe they're not buying it. They just don't know what it is.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's very hard to know. And it's not hard. We've talked about this before. You know, what the Democrats can, in fact, campaign on is not only all of the threats to our freedom and our democracy from Trump, but what they are doing for ordinary people that the Republicans are taking away.
I consider myself a Democrat. I only vote for Demi Moore.
Yeah.
Pretty good, huh? One thing we forgot to mention, too, is a lot of the more punitive things in this tax bill, this GOP tax bill, aren't going to come until after the midterms, and some of them aren't going to come until after the 28 election, too. So they're trying to sneak these things through in the long term.
Exactly.
And have not people really notice what they are or when they're going to become real.
But the problem with that is, are the tax cuts going to be postponed for 2 to 4 years?
You tell me.
No. And so these supposed offsets to the enormous hole, at least $5 trillion just from the tax cuts. You know, it goes down only when you offset, but there's not going to be any offset in the near term, and maybe not for years, if ever.
Right. George Miller USA says, I have 2 questions. 1.
2? I don't know if I can handle 2.
Oh. 1. What do you think of the issue of ghetto/criminality culture in the black community? And 2, what do you think of black fatigue?
I'm not sure that, you know, there's criminality culture in the black community. You know, that's something that conservatives will have you believe. The problem, you know, with black communities is not discrimination. It's not poverty. It's not punitive policing. It's not a lack of services. It's not bad education. Somehow it's a deficient culture. And, you know, that goes all the way back to the Moynihan report so many decades ago when he talked about the pathology of the black community and the black family. I don't buy it.
I mean, is there a bigger criminality culture in the current black community than there was in the 1960 Italian community?
Or anywhere else? You know, the crime rates are not highest in blue states. They're highest in red states with lax gun control laws.
Right. I guess I'm more talking about, you know, Italian culture had a high, well, I'm not saying it did, but, you know, for example, it had a big mafioso culture, especially in film and media, right?
Right, so that was, you know, translated, you know, illegitimately to the entire Italian community.
But it's funny, one thing I notice about right-wing commentators is they're often, especially talking from a visual media guy, they're often critical of art from about the black culture, like rap music or gang films or et cetera, and then they'll turn around in the same breath and say that, you know, The Godfather is the greatest movie ever created, and Martin Scorsese gangster films are pure art. You know, it doesn't. And
I'm not saying there are no issues with respect to crime in the black community, but it's much too simplistic to say, you know, there's a criminal culture when you have all of these other issues, which are much more solvable. Changing culture is very, very difficult.
John Rogers gifted 5 memberships. Thank you, John.
Very nice. We're getting the members. That's wonderful. So we have time for what? 3 more questions, maybe?
Yeah.
Do we have them?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Cosmo Trilby says, there has quite obviously been a serious decline in critical thinking skills throughout the past 20 years plus. So many people don't think about things before believing them. They see things simply instead of grasping nuance. I believe that this is a large contributing factor to Trump's election and eventual re-election. Do you agree? Also, historically speaking, is this a trend that has been seen before?
I absolutely agree with this. And I've cited this book before called Spin Doctors, in which they say it's control over information, manipulation of information, and devolution of education, that more than military action explains the rise of authoritarianism. And we're certainly seeing that in our society today. That's why we have this enormous partisan gap between college graduates and non-college graduates. That's why Trump is targeting colleges, universities, K-12 education. Is it really because Trump cares so deeply about anti-Semitism, Sam?
I don't think so.
No, come on. This is a guy who says very fine people chanting Jews will not replace us, who said, I'll blame the Jews if I lose this election. No, that's a pretext because he wants to stop critical thinking. He wants to impose his own orthodoxy, politically driven, and don't take my word for it. Look at the 1776 report that he issued at the end of his last term. He wants to impose that uncritical orthodoxy upon our entire educational system. And it's working. It's happening. It's part of that trend this question identifies, happening in places like Texas and Florida. It's very important. And the internet is aiding and abetting these trends because it divides us into bubbles where we only get information reinforcing what we already believe, and any contrary information bounces off the bubble.
Boing.
It never gets in because, it's the swamp, it's Biden, it's the lunatics, it's the left. We don't even need to consider it. So, yes, I think that's very important.
American presidents have been wise enough to negotiate trade policies while consulting with the U.S. Congress because what is good policy for one state is bad for another. From a historian's point of view, do you think this trade war will permanently decrease or damage the political and economic influence of the U.S.?
Absolutely. It's very important, as you say, that trade policies be worked out with the Congress, that they be negotiated and compromised. But Trump doesn't believe in that, right? Does he believe in the, division and separation of powers?
Hell no.
Hell no. He believes he has all the power, and he doesn't need to consult with Congress. And the last thing he wants to do is negotiate and compromise instead of issuing dictates. It certainly has already, I think, permanently damaged America's soft power, our standing, our prestige, our approval around the world. I'm always reluctant to say forever, but at least in the foreseeable future. And, its economic effects remains to be seen because Trump changes his mind every few minutes. One more question.
One more question.
One more
question of the night before we
try to make it a short one because I think it's already 10.
Well, we only have 2 questions left, so.
All right, I'll do them both.
Really?
Yeah. And do we have good news after this?
Yes, the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this. This is from Sandra. They say, my dad was a World War II vet.
So is mine, by the way.
True.
Your grandpa.
He always said, history unlearned is destined to repeat. I changed careers and became a teacher in 2003. My first year, we began teaching social studies 3 weeks on and then 3 weeks off. The students are voters now. Do you agree that minimizing the importance of teaching history has had an impact on the elections of the recent past?
Couldn't agree more. Of course, I'm a history teacher, too. I've been teaching a lot longer than you have and, at the college level. But as I said, control over education, control over what we think is the hallmark of modern authoritarianism. And if you don't know your history, you're not going to understand the present. It would be like coming into the fourth quarter of a football game and trying to understand it without knowing who's hurt, who's playing, or what the score is.
Good point.
Last question.
Our last question of the night. This is from Sean Matthew. They say, what do you think Tucker Carlson's reporting on Russia, especially his focus on things like grocery prices and public infrastructure, say about the way media influences how people perceive other countries compared to their own?
Absolutely. He has, you can dismiss him, as a tool of Russia, which I think may be accurate, my opinion. But he has an audience. He gets into that bubble, and he is influential, and he doesn't have an impact upon people. I've known him a long time, and I remember being interviewed by him many years ago, and I thought he was terrific. He was open-minded, independent, but this is a very different Tucker Carlson.
For sure. All right, with that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for this night. The good news is the Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this. Dad, what are your final words today?
My final words are that Trump and his allies should heed what Trump himself said, that we should honor the plain meaning of the Constitution and not read our own political values into it.
Nice. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
No, thank you.
All right.